So the portion of Mishpatim which we're talking about this week is unique because it has no less than 53 commandments of the 613 commandments. It's about a 12th of the entire Torah's messages and instructions are housed in this singular Shabbos. This Shabbos is also very unique in that we have 3 Sifrei Torah. We never do that very often, at least very rarely. We have the Sefer Torah that contains the book of Exodus to read the portion of Mishpatim. In addition to that, the Shabbat before Rosh Chodesh, or on Rosh Chodesh Adar, we read about the collection of the half a shekel, which was for communal needs. It was collected at this time of the year. It also happens to be Rosh Chodesh, so we will have in Shul no less than 3 Sifrei Torah taken out. It's rare. And then 53 of the 613 commandments. So it's impossible to have listed all of them. So I just took a few, a smattering of all different selections that are found in this week's Shabbos reading. It starts off talking about the civil code, and the first laws it deals with is about slavery. In itself, something that is difficult to understand. We'll come back to that. But what we learn is that a slave has to be freed after 6 years of service. In the 7th year, the slave has to go free. What happens if the servant says, no, ahavti es adoni, I desire to stay on, to be a slave. I don't want to go free. Then there's a whole process of the master taking his servant to the doorpost and goring his ear and saying that this ear that heard that man should be free and desires to stay on to be a slave, let this ear be pierced, so that you always remember that a person should not want to be a slave. We'll talk about the circumstances of slavery and why that would be a place to begin talking about our civil code. It speaks about the husband's obligations to his wife. It speaks about the punishment for murder, manslaughter, kidnapping, abusing parents. Penalties accrued by a person who injures another human being. And there are a number of them. There are all kinds of penalties aside from paying for the person's damages. There's medical penalties, there's loss of work penalties, there's embarrassment penalties. So there's a whole lot of listed in addition to the person's loss of limb and the value that that person has lost by not having a limb or whatever the damage was. Then we have the damage caused by your possessions. For example, an ox or a pit or arson are spelled out very clearly, because a person could say, I didn't do the damage, it was my ox. So the ownership of the ox makes a person liable. And furthermore, if a person digs a pit in the middle of the street, the Gemara says that it's a bit unusual, because what you do in the middle of the street in a public domain, you don't really have ownership of. You can't dig a hole and then start charging a toll for people to pass by your hole in the middle of the public domain. What you do in the public domain does not belong to you. So this is a rare situation where if you dig a pit in the public domain and somebody gets injured, you have to pay, and you don't have the defense to say, why are you attaching this pit to me? I don't own it. It's not my possession that caused the damage, but your action caused that another person be harmed, and therefore, obviously, one has to pay damages. Fire too, a person can't say, I just lit a fire in my own yard, I didn't know that it's going to spread to the next yard and then to the next city and then, God forbid, burn a whole lot of houses. How can I be liable? I just lit a fire in my own home. And the answer is that your action, even the action that spreads way beyond what you intended, the wind took your fire, but you're liable because it's your fire. So these are all major tractates of the Talmud, Baba Metzia, Baba Basra, Baba Kama, that talk about all of these monetary and financial responsibilities payments. Speaks about a person who steals is liable to pay the capital amount back, plus punitive damages. So there's a law of not just having to restore the damage, but to add a fifth of its value as an added penalty when one returns the damages. It speaks about a person's right to self-defense when facing a thief. If somebody burrows a tunnel under your home, and then you have reason to suspect that the person means you harm, and you defend yourself, then if a person who was attempting to come into your property, and it was reasonable to think that the person would possibly harm you because a person doesn't want to get caught. So therefore, in the event that he would get caught, he would harm you. If you killed that person before that person could harm you, you will not be held liable. And there are various situations that surround that. Then it speaks about the laws regarding a guardian of another possessions, a borrower, a renter. So there's a whole lot of different degrees of ownership or responsibility. If a person came to you and said, please, can I park my car in your driveway, and you do that as a favor, then the liability is very, very small. You might only be liable if you literally were irresponsible and you left the keys lying on top of the car and your gate open. The person had reasonable, it was reasonable for the person to expect you to do the minimum, to close your gate at night. That's why he brought you the car, and you accepted it, but there's no payment. So therefore the liability is very small. On the other hand, if he pays you, then you become very, very responsible. And if you borrowed something, then you're certainly responsible because the favor was to you. You asked him to borrow his car, so then the responsibility extends much more. If somebody knocks the car and it was completely beyond your responsibility, your ability to know that somebody's going to knock in your car, you're still liable because you were the one who borrowed the car. So all of that, the four guardians, the famous section in the Talmud, dealt with in many, many numerous pages. But then it shifts and speaks about sorcery, bestiality, offering sacrifices that are inappropriate. Thank you, I'll do that. I'm just wanting to mute everybody so that we don't have cross-talk. It speaks about all of these different categories of sorcery and bestiality, offering idolatrous sacrifice. The prohibition against harassing a foreigner, because we ourselves experienced what it's like to be a foreigner in a foreign land. So we have to look after the geir and the widow, defenseless people, an orphan, doesn't have parents, who have added responsibility, besides having the responsibility of loving one another, loving our neighbor and caring for one another. There's a whole added responsibility when that person is vulnerable because of circumstances in their own life. Okay, the mitzvah of lending money to the poor, the prohibition against lending with interest. So it actually says, the wording is, we'll come back to it, im kesef talved ma'mi, if you will lend money. It sounds like it is a choice, but the Talmud actually says there are various occasions that when the word if is used, or im, it actually means that you shall, that we have a responsibility to loan money to the poor. And it's one of the great mitzvahs of a gemilas chesed, of doing an act of kindness to a poor person. And when we do lend money, we're not allowed to charge interest. Prohibition against cursing a judge or a leader. Prohibition against consuming meat that was not ritually slaughtered. So it's quite a vast array of different disparate laws. An animal sacrifice must be older than 8 days old. 8 days old affects a person in the bris, the covenant that a child, Jewish boy, goes into. But also an animal less than 8 days old is not yet old enough to be brought as a sacrifice in the temple. Prohibition against perjury, judicial corruption. Do not lie, do not take a bribe. Responsibility to give agricultural tithes and in their proper order, because first you give to the Kohen, then you give a certain amount to the Levi. And if you reverse the order, the percentages that you have to give of your capital amount become affected by having given the wrong tithe or a gift that one has to give first. So the order has to be followed. There's a thing of sanctifying the firstborn son. Remember, in the initial stages, the firstborn acted as the tribe of Kohanim. They were the representatives of the Jewish people. It was only after the Egel Azav that the firstborn were replaced by the tribe of Levi. till today, we have the act of redeeming a firstborn son who's born to a Yisrael, to a regular Jew, not one who's born to a Levi or to a Kohen. It doesn't have to. Firstborn has to be redeemed. We return a lost animal to its owner. So that's one law that relating to animals. You see an animal that belongs to your enemy, it actually says. So you shall surely, hashev tashib, you shall return it, as the Gemara says even 100 times. At this point, you're really upset that your neighbor is not looking after his animal, but you have a responsibility to restore it. If his animal is overburdened and falling under its load, help the friend or even your adversary, your enemy, to unburden the animal. That's an act of kindness to animals. Shifting gears talks about the Shemitah, the sabbatical year. 6 years we work, the 7th year we allow the land to rest. And once we're on the subject of 6 and 7, we move from 6 years in the 7th year to 6 days in the 7th day, and we're reminded about the cycle of Shabbos. We have to rest, our cattle, our servants, everything has to rest on Shabbos. We are forbidden to mention the name of other gods, which is associated with idolatry. Remember, there's 53 commandments. I've just chosen some of them. We need to celebrate the 3 festivals, Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, and the pilgrimage to Yerushalayim, to the temple on those festivals. You should not cook meat in its mother's milk, one of 3 times that we are taught that commandment in the Torah. Then it tells us that if Bnei Yisrael eradicate idolatry from Israel, they'll be rewarded with sustenance, health, and longevity. Hashem warns Bnei Yisrael against entering into treaties with the Canaanite nations that are present there, that would be cause the downfall of the Jewish people. Then we shift to a totally different subject, which we emerged from last week, and that is Matan Torah, the receiving of the Torah. Moshe communicated Hashem's message. Bnei Yisrael passionately agreed to accept the message. They said the words Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will learn. And we'll come back to the order. The Gemara says, I'm a Paziza, we're such a strange people. Which people says, I will do even before I will learn what it is that I need to do. Nobody normally writes a check like that. I will write the check, you tell me, I'll sign it, and then you tell me what I have to write the amount in. First, you know what the amount is, and then you sign. Here we said to Hashem, we're ready to do whatever you ask, and then we will learn what to do. And that was considered a great act of righteousness of the Jewish people. Moshe would receive the Torah after being on the mountain for 40 days. So look at this parsha. It really goes through such a so many diverse subjects, so many topics. And let's try and take some of the message that we can take from it. The reason why I said in the message about tonight is that we're going to talk about subjective truth is because we have the very opening of this week's portion starts with the word and conjunction. And these are the laws which I've set before them. Ve'ele Mishpatim asher tasim lifneihem. These are the laws that you set in front of them, but it begins with the word and. So the Mechilta, which is the Midrash, and Rashi say, what's the and? And comes to connect to last week. So the and implies that they are a continuation of what was written before. Just as the laws above, the 10 commandments, which were given at Sinai last week, are from Sinai, these 2 are from Sinai. So what we actually have is a bit of an anticlimax. Because if you are coming out of Sinai, which was such a God revelation, a spiritual moment of communication between finite human being and infinite God, you would imagine that immediately after that, the kind of laws that we talk about would be very sublime, spiritual, religious laws, not things that relate to animals and financial payment and slaves. And that's one question. It seems to be an anticlimax to the great event that happened at Sinai. And not only is it that also these things were said, we emphasize and we say that the origin of our civil code is not man-made. The reason why we perform our human-to-human responsibilities is not because of our human understanding. Not only was the Sabbath and the laws that I am the Lord your God, given at Sinai, because human beings could not work that out on their own. But even the laws that relate on the left side of the Ten Commandments, do not kill, what it's saying to us is do not imagine that the rule of do not kill originates from a human understanding, a civil code that is based on what every constitution in the world would agree is an essential ingredient, that people do not kill one another, harm one another. So that could be a man-made law. We don't need God for those laws. So the Torah is telling us, and these are the laws which I've set before you. And all of these civil code laws were also traced back to Sinai. And the relevance to us is to say the reason that we perform the commandments that relate to man and man is not because of human understanding, even if we understand. That's not the reason. The reason is because God said so, and we need that. We need God to underpin even the most sensible, rational, obvious laws of the Torah. We need it to be God underpinned rather than formulated by human beings. And let's explore why. The Mishnah tells us that if the Torah wasn't given, we would have been able to learn certain laws of nature from the natural world. For example, it says if the Torah didn't tell us about stealing, not to steal, we could have learned that from ants. We all watch columns of ants. Unfortunately, I think the season right now is we see more ants than we want to, but they go in a straight line. They're walking the equivalent of probably about 20, 30, 40 kilometers with those little feet that they've got. And the one guy's carrying a crumb that he picked up somewhere in our kitchen, and he's all the way out towards the garden, far away. There's another guy coming in. He needs to get his crumb as well. You don't have one ant hijack another ant, hand over your goods. I don't want to go all the way for this journey. I want to take it from you. So we actually see that there's a great respect in the animal kingdom from one ant to another. And if God didn't tell us that we need to not steal, we would have been able to learn it from an ant. If God didn't tell us the laws of modesty, we would have been able to learn it, says the Mishnah, from a cat. If you look at a cat, it's different to a dog. When it has to has to relieve itself and pass from its bowels, it finds a secret place, a faraway place. It digs a hole, it covers the hole. It's very tsanua. It's very modest and hidden in its action. So we actually could have learned all of these things from nature. Nature would have inspired us to understand many of these laws. So then the obvious question is, well, if that's the case, why do we need a Torah? Why can't we just learn not to steal from ants? And the answer is that ants are great at observing the laws of theft when it comes to their own colony. But when colonies of ants go at war with one another, they pillage and destroy and maim and take everything in their wake. There's no mercy whatsoever. Yes, it is true that an ant in its own colony is respectful of somebody else's possession, but doesn't extend beyond the colony. A cat is a very modest creature. If you interview a cat, and anyone who's got a beautiful purring cat in their house, but you go and interview the nearest mouse in your house and ask them what they feel about the cat and the feline world, and they'll give you a whole different rundown. They'll say ferocious, horrific. They'll play with you. They'll destroy you for their own enjoyment. They'll extend the pain of death for as long as they possibly can. So that's what we're seeing over here, is that there are many areas of logic. But the problem with human logic is that human logic is affected by subjective perspective. Now, we could argue whether that is a general statement or not, but in our world today, and I've mentioned this before, we have become so polarized as human beings. We live in camps. We live in a world in which we think that there's so much more open-mindedness because a person doesn't have to go to school or to a shul or to a rabbi to get information. There's now no filter that can possibly stop a person broadening their information. Kids can get information on the internet today without the help of parents and teachers. So we can access information freely as no generation before this could do. And the irony is that today people have become so much more narrow-minded than in history. Because what happens is that when we go onto YouTube, we know that we visited various sites beforehand. There are algorithms that are worked out by YouTube, and they start projecting to you exactly what is in line with your last visit. Yeah, I recently rented a car a while ago, and the car happened to be a Renault. It's amazing. The next time I went on the computer, a whole lot of adverts for Renaults coming my way. Because the computers are busy working out who you are. So obviously you had a connection to that brand of car, you're interested, and now they'll start selling. They'll start sending you all the messages you can. And not only is it what is projected at us from the outside, it is our own choice. We feel comfortable watching CNN because we are more liberal and Democrat and left-wing inclined. And somebody else is more inclined to watch Fox News because that's right-wing and it's more associated with the Republican Party, and that's the person's preference. And because of that, that's the news they watch. And news, forget about it. As much as Fox or CNN say we're objective, we're just giving you the news. Just stick to the news, no opinion. It's all opinion-based. The news that you get is selective. So we get narrowed into a tiny little pipe of information. And we start listening to particular hosts and particular news services, and we become very, very involved with a very narrow group of people. In this broad-minded, broad-thinking world, we become so tiny and narrow. And because we're so subjective, we like to listen to the things that fit in with what it is we believe. That is the problem of subjectivity. And when we take it to an extreme, crazy things happen. One of the things I'm watching on the news, I'm not normally sharing like news events, but one of the things I've been watching is one of the decrees given by the president of the new president of America relating to participation in sport and transsexuals and their involvement in sport. And if a person happens to be born a man and identifies as a woman, so that person has to be allowed access to all the extracurricular activities at school and sport, and has to be able to play sport in the domain where that person associates and feels that that person feels most comfortable. So if he was biologically born a man and identifies as a woman, he can play sports with women. But what is obviously happening as a result of that is that you have a whole women's sports, which has allowed women to compete with one another and get bursaries into universities and get sponsorship. And there's a whole multi-million dollar industry that is investing in women. So liberal thinking can suddenly now say we have to be that liberal that we must allow 6'5" biological born men who identify as women to play basketball against 5 foot, which is the average 5'5" woman. Now what happens? Suddenly the first prizes all go, believe it or not. I mean, nobody could have really worked this out. All the first prizes and all the winners and all the new champions happen to be men who are born men and who identify as women and therefore are now classified as women. So I'm just giving an example of where a person wants to be liberal, wants to be able to understand more and more and meet the needs more and more, and eventually, out of being kind and kind and kind by our own understanding, we create something that is terribly cruel. And I'm giving another example of abortion, which is a very difficult subject, and there are many different sides to this, and it's a very controversial subject. But the bottom line is that when you hear a doctor describing the procedure, especially in a late pregnancy of an abortion, it is dismembering an unborn child, leg by leg and hand by hand and finger by finger, and it is the most gruesome possible description. But because it comes into conflict with the choices of an individual and the supposed health benefits to a mother, so a child can be killed at this point and not at that point. Who determines that? When human beings become the master of their own destiny and we make the rules, we can rearrange those rules so subjectively. When you're talking about right-wing nationalism, we had the Yamach Shemam, the Nazis, who exterminated Jews because how could a supposedly cultured country like Germany allow themselves to murder people? The human mind is so elastic. Our own subjectivity is able to incorporate so much that eventually, if you say the lie enough times, that Jews are the vermin of the world, the cause of all the problems and difficulties, the financial problems, the health problems, everything, the religious problems, everything is because of the Jews. You say it enough time, you now need to protect society from the Jews, and now killing 3-6 million people is actually not considered killing at all. And when Mengele came home after a hard day's work of determining who lives and who doesn't live, the story goes, he would not put the light on in his home in case he woke up his budgie, because that's how kind and considerate he was. How do human beings allow themselves to spend the whole day murdering and come home and then think of themselves and portray themselves as the kindest, most noble human beings who wouldn't want a budgie to be, God forbid, woken up from its sleep? Human beings can stretch truth in a million different directions. And in the same way as when you watch a soccer match, which is less consequential, and there's a question whether it went over the line or didn't go over the line. Was it a goal or was it not a goal? Invariably, all those supporters of the defending team say that it didn't go over the line. And all those who are the supporters of the attacking team swear by the fact that the ball did go over the line, because our understanding of truth is how we want to see it. And that's inconsequential to a degree, because it's, some people say that life is rugby is more important than life itself. But let's say that's by comparison inconsequential. But right now you have a question that America is divided, 74 million, 78 million people deciding whether this is right or that is right. And clearly the thought processes are determined by allegiance and by party. And as a result of which side of the party line you belong, that is how you determine seichel, our understanding of the events. And this should remind us that when we have a code that relates to our responsibilities to one another, it was not founded by people, not even the founding fathers, not even people so important who lived hundreds of years ago, who were so wise and did things that we must respect and we have to live up to the Constitution that they wrote. Not even that. Much, much more profound. The reason that we do not steal and we do not kill, and we have to be responsible to one another and care for one another and not steal and return lost items and be careful with the widow, is not because of our compassion. That can kick in too, should. But the real underpinning of every single one of those is because I believe in an infinite God, and that God is wise way beyond the wisdom of a human being, and that is what preserves that law for eternity. And that's why these laws are still relevant thousands of years later. So this first slide is such an important part of the entire portion. It tells us, Ma elu misinai, just as these were given at Sinai, these were given at Sinai. The reason that we do the simple interactions between human beings that we logically could so easily understand without God The reason that we do it because God said so is that we don't become the authors, the subjective authors of truth. And that's unfortunately what is so proliferated in the world that we live in. Let's try and move in. We talk about a slave. So what's very important to understand is that a slave is not as we understand it, that there was people that went off to Africa and captured hapless people and then traded in them for their own benefit. A Jewish slave that we're talking about is somebody who either stole and is unable to restore the damages of what that person stole. They stole 100,000 rand and they don't have that money to repay it. Our conventional understanding is put the person in jail, at least let them suffer, at least be an example to others. But meantime, the person doesn't get their 100,000 rand back. In times of old, when a person stole 100,000 rand and he could not pay it back, he sold himself, or the Beth Din sold that person, so that the money realized from the sale of that individual can be used to pay back the damages that that person caused. Sometimes a person is so poor that he cannot support himself or his family, he would sell himself in order to have a roof over his head. And in both of these cases, whether Beis Din is selling a person or a person is selling himself in order to be able to protect the needs of his family, the Torah is telling us that it's only for 6 years. There's no such thing as eternity. You're a child of God, and you are a servant of God. You're not a servant of another human being. And then the Talmud carries on to say that if you do buy a slave, your responsibility is extensive. He must eat the same food that you eat. He must live in the same living conditions that you live in. You must take care of all of his family's needs and education of his children. It continues to tell how the person cannot be told to do labor that is degrading. He cannot be told to do labor that's not productive. That's simply to get the enjoyment of a person carrying stones back and forth across the lawn. No, there has to be a reason and a purpose and a goal. So much so does the Talmud enumerate the responsibilities of a slave owner to the slave that it says, he who buys himself a slave has bought himself a master. Because you owe much more than you can possibly benefit from the slave. It's not advisable. But at any rate, if it is a contract that is gone into in order to pay back damages or a loan or money stolen, if the person is sold, it's maximum for 6 years. It comes at the end of 6 years and it says, I want to stay on. Well, if you read the verse in its simple meaning, it'd say, why? Why would any person want to stay on? Well, after you read the Torah, the Talmud, on what the responsibilities are to a slave, you'll understand why he wants to stay on or could want to stay on. Because he's had all this food taken care of, all of the responsibilities exceeded his lifestyle that he ever had until then. He's now living in a beautiful home and eating with a family, eating steak. So maybe he doesn't want to go home. But the Torah says it's a sin not to want to go home. At the end of 6 years, go free. And if you don't, then the ear that heard at Sinai that you are slaves to God and to God alone and not slaves to another human being, so that person should have his ear gored to remind himself that the ear did not listen properly as to what our purpose is in this world. We should not be slaves of another human being. But at any rate, it starts telling us the civil code specifically about dealing with slaves, because it actually is counterintuitive. What it's saying is that all the responsibilities to a human being are responsibilities to the most vulnerable element of society. The person you bought because he stole and has caused damages and has only one way to repay them, by being sold out. And you would think that this human being is such a riffraff, low-down individual, you have no responsibilities to that person. We're now getting a counterintuitive approach to understanding why it begins with the laws of slavery, to say even the most vulnerable human being who has a million reasons why they are deserving of being a slave, because they stole and because they have to restore money, and don't use your position that enables you to lord over another human being to treat that person less than special. Treat every human being kindly. So we're actually starting with a slave, not because it's telling us that it's a good thing to be a slave or to own a slave. It's quite the contrary. But if you do, that person should be looked after. And how much more so every other human being that you don't have rights to. It says that you'll bring him to the doorway. It has a reminder of the doorway. What's it got to do with freedom? Because the doorway conjures the image in our head of the doorway of Pesach, which we'll celebrate in 8 to 7 weeks, where the blood of our Paschal offering was put on our doorway to differentiate between the Jewish home and other homes. And that was the first step, the first mitzvah that we performed on our way to our freedom. So the commentaries say the reason why this slave, in subsequent years, 1,000 years later, was taken specifically to the doorpost, the place where we made the sign that represented freedom, is to remind the person, think again. You do not want to stay on beyond the 6 years. And if the person decided nonetheless to do that, then the maximum is the Jubilee year. In the Jubilee year, the person goes free anyway. So there is no forever as a slave. The Das Zakenim says that the word martzea, which is the oar, the name of the utensil that is used to pierce the ear, is a martzea, has the numerical value of 400, and it represents the 400 years of slavery in Egypt. So the slavery in Egypt should be the reminder to us that we don't want to go there. Slavery is against. It is not appropriate to own a slave, and it's certainly not appropriate to want to be a slave. It is wrong. But in the circumstance of slavery, these are the ways that you make sure to take care of your slave. This is just a very general statement in Baba Kama, which says that a person's fighting somebody else, strikes another with a stone or with his fist. It says that a person is always liable for damages that you cause, whether inadvertently or willfully, whether awake or asleep. How much damage can a person do when they're asleep? I don't know, maybe they can go sleepwalking. If a person blinded his neighbor's eye or broke his articles, full compensation must be paid. We don't have the excuse to say that I was blinded or I didn't see what was going to happen. In terms of damages, you have the responsibility to offset and to ensure that the person who suffered loss will have it restored. This is a general statement in the Talmud, very interesting, far-reaching statement, that you pay the loss of his work. We already said there are a number of categories of penalties you pay a person to whom you have damaged, in addition to the loss of limb. That's the loss of work, the embarrassment, the healing, the cost of doctors, medical bills. So it says that and you will pay for it, and then he will certainly be healed. So the Gemara says, Mikan shenitnu reshus l'rofe l'rapos. From here we derive that a physician is allowed to heal. And why would you think that a doctor does not have a right to heal? Because there is a headspace that a person might think and might have. We don't allow a person to say, since God afflicted the person, why should I get involved? Why should I get involved with somebody else's suffering? Why is the person suffering? Because God decided that that person must suffer. So why should I interfere? Maybe I'm going against the will of God by interfering. So that absurd line of thought is undermined by this verse, which says that you will certainly pay all the damages of the doctor, and the healer should give healing. So the most professional person should be consulted in healing, and God gives that person the gift of healing. We partners. We partners in creating a better world that God has created, and we partners in having the most professional person help the process of healing, and that's a responsibility. It's so obvious, but it's a general statement of partnership, man and God. Sorry. Slipped out of this. So sorry. So sorry. Okay, we have an interesting statement in the Torah, which is that if you damage a person and you cause him to lose sight, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, And we know that Hammurabi's rules that go back many, many years to ancient civilization, that is what they did. There's a person who's caused somebody else not to see with an eye, you gored out that person's eye. If you cause that person to lose a finger, you chop off somebody's finger or hand. And the Talmud goes to great lengths to say that for all the reasons that brings proofs from other verses, it means monetary compensation. We never cause a person physical damage as restitution to somebody else. If the person caused somebody else to lose an eye, we work out what is the financial obligation to this person. What loss have they had in income? What loss have they had in terms of value as a person? Pain and embarrassment and doctors, and all of that has to be paid. Monetary. You don't gore out a person's eye. Just interesting that the Vilna Gaon says that the words ayin, tachas ayin. Ayin underneath or instead of an eye for an eye. But the Hebrew word tachas means an eye underneath an eye. So he says, look at the letters underneath the word ayin. The letter following ayin is pei. The letter following yud is chaf. And the letter following nun, or underneath it, if you lined up all the letters underneath it, would be a samach. So in actual fact, you have alluding to the fact that the word of chaf, samach, pei, the letters underneath the letters ayin, yud, nun, are the letters chaf, samach, pei, which spell kesef, which is the Hebrew word for money. So the Vilna Gaon actually says that it's alluded to in the verse itself, that it's not physical harm that you do to somebody, but it's financial payment. We spoke about the various kind of guardians, a person who borrows, a person who's paid to look after something or doing it for free, different degrees of responsibility. We said that if you lend money to any of my people, to the poor amongst you, so whenever the Torah says the word if, or when, the implication is that we are speaking of an action that is optional, except in 3 instances, and this is one of them, where the obligation is absolute, that we have to take care of the next individual and look after them. So now I just want to share some of the wording that is in the verse. When you lend money to my people, the commentaries explain, what's the emphasis of my people? Look at every other human being as God's people, as a child of God. Your degree of compassion is going to be different if you look at another human being, not as a hapless, unfortunate, dirty, sullied person that's irrelevant to my life. Look at every other human being and see in them the child of God. That's the first perspective that helps us give with generosity. Secondly, to the people amongst you, in Kesef Tavias es he'ani imach. If you read the words a little bit out of the literal sense, to the poor is amongst you. What it actually is implying is that the money that is for the poor is amongst you, which implies that in actual fact, how should we look when we give? We should look that God could have given this poor person directly. God could have made a socialist, a communist regime where everybody would have had exactly the same amount. There wouldn't have been haves and have-nots. Everyone would have had. But God made some rich and some poor so that the rich would have the opportunity of giving. And God, in fact, put money in our bank accounts as custodians of giving. So it's a second thought that we should have when we look at a person who needs help. We should look at that person as really the money that I have was given to me by God for a reason, and that is to help and to give. The third point is that we should have empathy and identification. Ani imach, to the poor amongst you, means look at the poor as amongst you. Identify with that poor person. Imagine that you were sitting there without shoes. Imagine that you were the person who was cold in the winter or didn't have food. So all of these are hidden messages in this verse that if we want to be better givers, we should have a thought. And finally, the commentaries say, Ani imach, the poor amongst you, is telling you that in actual fact, we benefit from the act of giving even more so than the poor who receives from us. That in actual fact, giving enables us to receive much, much more valuable, important, receiving the value more than we actually give to the person who receives. And we should look at it. We should see ourselves as being able to do that. I'm going to end off with one last thing. This slide, which is a little bit complicated, but let me just go through it with you. Last slide. If you see the donkey of your enemy, obviously your friend for sure, but even your enemy, collapsing under its burden, and you are inclined to desist from helping him, your first thought is, no, I actually don't want to get involved. Azoiv ta'azoiv imay, you shall surely help along with him. With him, so if he decides he can sit under the tree and watch you work, no, with him, but you should help. You should step in and help. So the deeper understanding of this verse is the word donkey in Hebrew is chamar, which means, in addition to the meaning of donkey, it means, chamar comes from the Hebrew word chumriyut, which means physicality. So let's completely take this verse out of its simple meaning, which obviously has to be its meaning, but beyond that, and in addition to its simple meaning, kisire, if you will look, it instructs us the proper attitude towards the physical elements of our lives, the body and physicality. When you will see the chamor of your enemy, the physical elements of your life, and you will think this is the enemy. I'm a spiritual person. I want to pursue godliness. And here I have an enemy within who's my physical needs, my physical responsibilities, and there is this enemy within. Initially, you will see your material self as your enemy, as something that obstructs and hinders your spiritual growth. Collapsing under its burden, in such a state of animosity between body and soul that the body resists the Torah and its commandments, making them an unbearable burden for it. So it's collapsing. It's saying, I can't handle 613 commandments. I can't even handle one. I don't believe in the effort that is required to be a Jewish spiritual person. So the physical, the chamor, which means the physical elements of our being, is crumbling and falling apart under the burden of spiritual responsibility. And one's first inclination is to say, I desist from helping him. I don't want to get involved with my physical body. I don't want to get involved with it at all. My soul wants to soar. I don't care for it. So ultimately the Torah says, Azoiv ta'azoiv ima, you shall surely help along with him, with the donkey, but we're learning it deeper, with your physical element. Work together with your body and your physical elements rather than destroying it. Aid the material self with its burden by training it to recognize that the Torah is the vehicle for its own refinement and elevation. This is the Baal Shem Tov. The bottom line is, when we are confronted by a physical distraction, our initial reaction can be, destroy it. Make sure that the distraction is not there anymore. Whatever that physical distraction, there might be a talent that you have for music or for dance or for study that is outside of the Torah. And your mind or your physical desire is taking it another way. So you say, kill off the body, destroy it. I don't want it to be relevant in my life at all. That might be your first reaction. What's the real goal? The real goal of a successful life in this world is to realize that our physical body is not our enemy. It might have desires that are different to our soul, but our goal is to marry our soul and our body so that ultimately the body becomes the agent of achieving God's purpose in this world. Our hands are there to put on tefillin and to help the poor. And our eyes are able to see and behold the needs of others. And all the physical elements of our life are there as a means of the soul achieving its purpose in this world. Don't see the physical as the enemy. Maybe at the beginning it's a complication. It wants things different to what your soul wants, and therefore you're frustrated. But ultimately, don't see the physical world as your enemy. See it as an opportunity to channel it to serve God. That is the objective. And if you see an ox running towards you while you're trying to plow your field, we've used this analogy many times, the one answer could be kill the bull, because the bull is creating a problem. You're trying to plow the field, and it's this, and then now you have a bull coming towards you. Kill the bull. But ultimately, the objective is to get a nose ring through the bull and to attach the bull to the plow so that you can plow your field much, much faster than you ever could. The physical of our lives and the physical desires of our lives, if they're channeled in the right direction, can help our soul grow and develop much more than without it. So that's a deeper understanding of a verse. Look at the donkey, look at the physical elements, and see the opportunities of allowing it to lift the spiritual. Thank you. Time has run out. I really appreciate everyone for joining us. We didn't get through the whole list of all of our slides. Very busy parsha, 3 Torahs on Shabbos, 53 commandments. Hope I'll see you in shul. We're very careful and very cautious and looking after everybody. Social distancing. Please join us when you can. Have a beautiful week.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.